Hey, history fans! Welcome to episode 43 of the England series. We left King Charles last week, preparing to escape from Hampton Court. There was little adventure in his escape from the palace, though we may be sure his heart was beating just as hard as any man's through moments of perilous uncertainty. Escape here was little more than a simple matter of walking quietly out of the palace and into the open, fresh night air. For the king was not heavily guarded here, since he had promised not to try to leave. Though, clearly it was a promise that he was not keeping. Perhaps it was the fear of being murdered that drove him to do it. But whatever the case, Charles didn't seem to have any qualms about tarnishing his honor by breaking his word. Accompanying Charles on this new escapade were John Berkeley, William Leger, and okay, I'll be honest here, I actually have no idea how to pronounce his last name. Leger sounds way cooler than leg, though, which is the only other way I can think of to say it. And last of all, the faithful Ashburnham. Jack, as you may remember him, from Charles' escape from Oxford the year before. The four of them struck out southwest on horseback. They rode all that night, and on into the next day, not even stopping to eat or rest. The weather was stormy, and at one time they lost their way in Windsor Forest, but eventually they made it to relative safety. They had come to Titchfield, the home of the royalist Earl of Southampton, and the Earl readily took the runaway king into his protection. But Charles could not stop here. He must still go on, for the Roundheads were sure to come and find him. He considered going to the little Isle of Wight, a place he believed was full of his supporters. It was also an easy middle step between England and the continent, should he choose to sail for France. For, you see, Charles was not quite decided about just what he wanted to do. Secondarily, if the island turned out not to be an option, he would try to find a boat to go to France directly from Titchfield. The king and Leger stayed behind at the Earl's home, whilst Berkeley and Ashburnham took a little boat to the Isle of Wight to speak with the governor there, a man named Robert Hammond. This is something that has confused many students of history over the years. For though Robert Hammond's grandfather, John Hammond, had served so long ago as personal doctor to King James, Robert himself was certainly no friend to the crown. He had served on Parliament's side in the late war, and had just recently been sent by them to govern this little Isle of Wight. Why Charles would think he could trust this Roundhead governor is a bit strange. The only thing we have to go on is an account from Ashburnham, who claimed to have met Hammond some time ago as he was traveling to his new island post. According to Ashburnham, Hammond said he was glad to be leaving for Wight because he found the army was going to break all promises with the king, and that he would have nothing to do with such perfidious actions. Whether Hammond actually said this or not, we can't be sure. But if so, perhaps Ashburnham had shared the comment with Charles, and it had made the king hope that Hammond would have pity on him. As it was, Hammond was rather confused when the two visitors presented themselves to him. He could not guess what their business might be. Berkeley ventured first, with a sort of roundabout question. "Do you know who is near you?" Now Hammond was even more confused. Why was this stranger asking him such a strange question? He told him he didn't know. Berkeley should have been much more careful with his words. He should have tried to see how Hammond felt about the king before telling him everything. But, as some men do sometimes, he opened his mouth just a little too widely. "Even good King Charles," he told Hammond, "who has come from Hampton Court for fear of being murdered privately." The whole story came spilling out. Then the two royalists asked the governor if he would let Charles come to the island under his protection. Now Hammond had to make a choice. Would he help the king? or would he do his duty as a soldier of Parliament? He gave the two visitors a very uncertain answer. "I shall act with honor," is all he would say. And, well, whether he did or not is for you to judge. All the time, while Ashburnham and Berkeley were gone, Charles had tried to find a boat headed for France, but to his dismay, had found that all the ports were closed. The army had already found out about his escape, and were trying to lock him within the country. Now he was more uneasy than ever, and the next thing he knew, Ashburnham was back, with the news that Hammond was outside waiting to see him. Charles was rather upset about this. He had not really been sure if he trusted Hammond to help him, and he certainly had not wanted the governor to know where he was until he was sure of it. Now Hammond could easily inform his enemies where he was. "Oh, Jack," the king cried, "thou hast undone me!" You may be sure that Ashburnham and Berkeley were sorry for their failure to be more cautious. And, indeed, their error was to cost the king dearly. Hammond was civil enough, and took Charles back with him to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. But, for all the governor's cordial hospitality, Charles was not at all fooled. This castle was only another prison, for Hammond's loyalty lay unshakably with Parliament. Once Charles was comfortably settled in, the governor sent word to London. The king's few short days of freedom were ended.